Well, good morning. It's my pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I appreciate what a distinguished group of people have gathered here this morning. And I will talk a little bit about where the cloud is going. I have to say this is a great place to have this conversation because, as you all know, Denmark has been at the forefront when it comes to digital technology, not just for the past year or two, but in many ways for the last decade or two. And it's also, I think, fitting to have so many members of the diplomatic corps here because in the news of late has been the fact that Denmark has also been, according to the press, the first country to appoint an ambassador to the tech sector. Actually, the British government has had somebody serving in a somewhat similar role. So the fact that we brought together the British Chamber of Commerce and people who are living and working here in Denmark is especially appropriate. There, now the clicker is working. What I really wanted to start with this morning is some perspective on where the world is going. Because I do think we're at the dawn of a new industrial revolution. And as we think about the future, there's a lot that we can learn from the past, specifically the industrial revolutions that have preceded this one. The first industrial revolution started in the United Kingdom. It started in England in the 1760s. It began with the invention of the steam engine. And by the time it had run its course, I think the biggest impact that it had was it changed forever human imagination. For the first time, humanity had built a machine that could travel faster than a horse. And the lesson, I think, for us is clear. As we look to the future, there are many things that we can imagine already, but there are many things that we probably cannot. The future will be full of surprises, and we have to prepare ourselves to manage surprises as well as the expected. The first industrial revolution, in the minds of many historians, was followed by a second industrial revolution that began in the 1870s. And one of the inventions that was of profound importance around the world was really commercialized for the first time south of here in Germany by Carl Benz. This photograph was taken in 1895. And as you can see, he had enough confidence in the automobile to allow his two daughters to drive the one in front of himself. Now, what is interesting is that this photograph here in 1895 was taken 10 years before the next one. This was taken in New York at an intersection on Broadway in 1905. And even though it followed by 10 years those two vehicles on that German road, if you study this photograph carefully, you will see trolleys and horses, but not a single automobile. Now look at the next photograph taken at exactly the same intersection 20 years after that, in 1925. You will see trolleys and automobiles and not a single horse. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from these three photographs. The attention begins early, even the excitement begins early, but it does take time for technologies to be perfected and then diffused broadly. But once they start to be diffused around the world over the course of about 20 years, they in effect remake everything. We saw this to some degree in the third industrial revolution as well. This began in the 1960s with larger computers. They then became smaller computers, and we at Microsoft played a part in that. It changed the way the world creates, the way it communicates, the way it connects with people. But I think perhaps more than anything else, all of the advances of the third industrial revolution laid the foundation for what is now coming in the fourth. The World Economic Forum published last year a book about the fourth industrial revolution. And I think one of the most useful contributions the book made was to delineate the various technologies that are changing. In fact, there's three broad categories. The first is in the area of the physical world. We're seeing new materials, 3D printing, autonomous vehicles, and robotics all change the devices that we interact with in the physical world. But in addition, we're seeing advances in the world of biology, as the understanding of the human genome has led to new forms of genetic engineering, new advances in healthcare, and ultimately changes for agriculture and livestock as well. And finally, we're seeing changes in the digital world, whether it's the Internet of Things, new technologies like blockchain, or disruptive business models all around us. Now, if you look back at all of these industrial revolutions, you tend to see that each revolution tends to be founded on one or two enabling technologies. It was the steam engine, and then it was electricity, and then it was the combustion engine, and then it was the microprocessor. Well, similarly, all of the technologies on this slide are connected to the same thing. They're all fundamentally based on the massive computational power that exists in the cloud, which really means large data centers around the world. And increasingly, it is cloud computing that is connected by and helped by artificial intelligence as well. It's certainly interesting to think about the benefits that are accruing already. One sees that here in Denmark. One sees it in small businesses like this one. A small business that is using the cloud to create accounting software for other small businesses and already supporting 30,000 customers. That's what Dinero has been able to do. But it's not just the world of business that's being reshaped by all of this. Here in Denmark, we're seeing as well advances when it comes to helping refugees navigate the local processes to register under asylum law, using cloud computing connected to mobile devices. All of this, I think, creates a lot of cause for optimism about the future. But there's a big but. At the same time that all of these good things are moving forward, I think it's only right that we also pause and reflect upon the challenges that technology tends to create. Because every era of technological change creates both opportunities and challenges, and this one will be no different. In fact, increasingly, if you follow the events of the world, one of the biggest questions is whether we can live in a world where technology moves forward without leaving some people behind. Indeed, in many countries on most continents, there are some important groups of people that increasingly feel left behind in this new era. If we're going to address those challenges, I think we have to do so with a sense of shared responsibility. Government needs to play an important role. But governments cannot solve these problems by themselves. Those of us in the technology sector have to step up. Those of us across the business community need to play a role. People throughout civil society and all of us as individuals have a role to play. It's that basic concept that we sought to capture late last year when we at Microsoft published this book called A Cloud for Global Good. In effect, what we sought to do was identify the issues that we think are important. And they really fall into three categories: issues around inclusion, responsibility, and trust. And I'll talk about each of these briefly this morning. Let me start with inclusion, because I think in many respects, it is one of the defining issues of our time. If we want to reflect on what's happening in the world, well, one need only start with this photograph of the assembly line for an automobile a century ago and look at what is increasingly the prototype for an automobile assembly line today. Where have all the people gone? It's not a question that people ask only when it comes to the assembly of automobiles. It's actually an important reminder that we've long lived in a world, indeed for over 2 centuries, where jobs are created and then they disappear. There was a time about 60 years ago when every elevator had a job inside it. We no longer step into elevators and expect to see people employed inside them. But we do continue to step into taxis and expect to see people employed behind the wheel. That world may change as well. Indeed, what we're really asking around the world is, where will the new jobs come from that will replace the jobs that will disappear? And equally important, who will fill these jobs? That's what these taxi drivers in Vienna, in effect, were arguing about the day they staged a strike upon the arrival of Uber. What we're clearly seeing is that jobs are changing. They're changing around the world, and they're changing in many ways. They're changing because of new technology, but they're also changing because of new business models. People increasingly will have multiple jobs at the same time. They'll certainly have multiple jobs or even careers over the course of their lifetime. And increasingly in many countries, people are working as independent contractors or on a part-time basis. But because jobs are changing, it means that people's needs are changing as well. People need to acquire new skills. Some of these are digital skills, but there are also important non-digital technological skills, and there are soft skills as well. As much as anything, I think this should cause all of us in the business community to reflect upon our need to think and act broadly. That's certainly what we're striving to do. Across Europe, the European Commission noted that there is, in fact, a very significant challenge. It's the same challenge that exists in North America. It's the same challenge that exists in Japan. There is a gap when it comes to digital skills. As the European Commission concluded today, there are 44% of Europeans who still lack basic digital skills. But I think what is most striking is that there are over 750,000 jobs that will go unfilled 3 years from now because of this gap in digital skills if steps are not taken to address this. So the question becomes, what should we do? Well, I think in important respects, it needs to start with investing in the next generation of people. We certainly need to ensure that our young people in Denmark, across Europe and around the world, have the opportunity to acquire the skills they'll need for the future. And there is good news all around us. Here in Denmark, there was a group that started up 2 years ago called Coding Pirates. Microsoft was the first partner for this nonprofit. They've already trained over 14,000 students. They've worked with 375 teachers. It's a wonderful start. It also underscores that no single initiative can fill the skills gap. No single company can hope to address all of this. It will take a multiple set of steps to really do the job. But certainly investing in digital skills for the next generation of people is an important place to start. But there's clearly more to it than this. We need to focus on the workforce needs of tomorrow. That was a big part of the thinking that led us at Microsoft last year to make the biggest acquisition in our history when we acquired LinkedIn last June. It gives us the opportunity with LinkedIn to create technology tools to help people learn online in small slices and more broadly if they want to do so. It gives us new tools to help people know where the jobs are, to begin to discern what the skills are for those jobs, and to begin to document themselves in terms of their qualifications. We need to, in effect, invigorate on an ongoing basis jobs and job markets around the world. As we do so, we need to think beyond digital technology. We need to think about all of the jobs that are going to require new levels of training. The reality is that so many aspects of manufacturing and every other part of the economy are being transformed. Digital skills are important to almost every job, but so are lots of other more advanced skills as companies change the way they work. It means, in effect, that we need to build learning economies around the world. Just as I think employers have come to recognize that you cannot be a healthy company without continually investing in the education of your employees, countries are going to need to do more to invest in the ongoing educational and training opportunities of their populations. As we do that, we need to recognize the increased diversity that surrounds us everywhere. Diversity has become one of the great imperatives around the world. whether it's because of refugees or immigrants, or simply the fact that the world as a whole is connected in ways that we must understand each other better if we're going to build businesses that can export their goods and services to other places. And as we think about the needs of diverse people, it's not only the people that sometimes look different or speak differently or come from a different place, it is sometimes the hidden diversity in our midst. Because the truth is, 1 in every 8 individuals in the world has some form of disability. Now, sometimes it's an obvious disability. Someone may not be able to walk. But sometimes it's much more hidden than that. It may be obvious to the person, but not to their colleagues. And for those of us who are in the technology sector, who create the tools that people use in their everyday lives, it's more incumbent on us than ever before to make sure that we are enabling people with all kinds of needs to get the best out of themselves by getting the most out of what we create for them. All of these things are going to need to come together to build a more inclusive world. If that were the only thing we needed to do for this new cloud-based era, we would have a formidable challenge in front of us. But there's more to it than that. There are issues that I think go to the core of responsibility, starting with sustainability. Denmark is a great place to come and talk about sustainability. You can't help but come here and be reminded as soon as you arrive at the airport by the renewable energy around us. But here we are today on International Water Day, and it's a fitting day to talk about the advances that technology can bring to the management of water, something that we did more to talk about yesterday as a company in a new partnership with a US and global company, Ecolabs, to enable the broad use of big data and machine learning so that governments and companies around the world can better assess their water resources and make decisions with an eye towards more efficient water management. But it does require more than that. Around the world, we need to do everything we can to focus harder on the need for more sustainable energy. That's why we at Microsoft last year announced a new set of commitments to the use of green energy in our data centers. It's interesting, if you look at the data centers of a Microsoft or an Apple or an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google today, each of us already consumes more electricity than a small state in the United States. And in a decade or so, each of us may consume more electricity than a small or mid-sized country in Europe. It makes it imperative that we use more renewable energy, more wind, solar, and hydropower. And that's what we've committed to do with a set of clearly delineated, quantifiable, and transparent targets. Finally, there's the last issue I want to talk about, and that's the issue of trust. In many ways, this is the issue that has been the most important in the world of diplomacy over the last few years, because it has called upon governments to focus more on how they interact with each other across borders. It starts with what people expect from the cloud. Fundamentally, everywhere in the world we find the same thing. People want the kinds of protections they've had when they put information down on paper to persist, when they move their information to the cloud. Not in every country. There's a few countries where people are nervous about the protection they have for what's on paper, but in most of the world, and certainly across Europe, it has been apparent that this is what the public wants. Well, that's not possible without advances in technology and law and diplomacy. You know, that's why the EU Privacy Shield issue was so important last year. It's why Microsoft was the first company to endorse the Privacy Shield so that Europeans would have confidence that their rights would be protected even when their data moved to the United States. It's why we were early to endorse the new GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, which we believe will strengthen the protection of people's privacy rights here in Europe itself. It's also why we as a company sued our own government, the United States government, in fact, not once, but 4 times, including once around a fundamental issue of diplomacy. The basic question was whether the US government could use a unilateral search warrant issued in New York to reach into our data center in Ireland to compel us to take the email that belonged to someone who had not been to the United States, who was not an American, to take email that had never been stored in the United States and move it across the Atlantic and hand it over to the US government. Well, the good news is we won a major victory in that case when the Court of Appeals for the Federal Second Circuit in New York ruled unanimously in our favor last year that, in fact, US government search warrants cannot compel Microsoft to turn over customer data that is stored exclusively outside the United States. But what this in effect shows is the need for a new generation of international law. Laws that will enable governments to work with each other quickly when law enforcement needs require them to do so, but in a manner that respects the role of local laws, local governments, local courts, and fundamentally the local rights of people everywhere. But there's one last issue I'd like to close on before we open it up for questions, and that's the other fundamental need that we all have if we're going to ensure that we live in a world and rely on technology that we can trust. And that's the issue of security, specifically cybersecurity. This is a challenging time. You see this not only in the headlines of the world, but you see it in the understandings and expectations of people. Roughly 3/4 of companies around the world expect that they will be hacked during the course of this year. Economists estimate that by the end of this decade, we will suffer $3 trillion of economic damage. And if there is one aspect of cybersecurity that I think has continued to worsen over the past year, it goes to the heart, I would argue, of diplomatic relations between countries, because it goes to nation-state attacks. It's interesting because when you think about it, conflict between human beings began on land, and then it moved to the sea, and after several millennia, it moved to the air, and yet just a century after that, it moved into cyberspace. Indeed, cyberspace is the new battlefield, if you will. But in some ways, it's a different kind of battlefield, because cyberspace actually is private property. It's data centers, it's cables that are owned by companies like Microsoft, it's laptops, it's servers, it's smartphones that are owned by people like you. We are all suddenly finding ourselves not only near the battlefield, but at the battlefield itself. Indeed, for those of us in the tech sector, we found ourselves suddenly to be the first responders. Oftentimes, the first response to an attack by one state upon another is not a response by diplomats or the military, but private parties who work for tech companies who have to respond quickly. And yet there's a piece of this that is even more sobering than that. Because for 67 years, there has been an agreement, not only among diplomats, but among states, that governments have a legal responsibility to protect civilians even in times of war. But what is happening in these nation-state attacks? Governments are attacking civilians in a time of peace. This is not the world that the internet's inventors envisioned just a quarter of a century ago. It is called on those of us in the tech sector to take new steps, to look at the data that we have, to harness that data, and where we can, to even use legal process itself, as we've done since last summer over 60 times, to respond to a nation-state set of attacks at customers, as you can see on this map, who are literally located around the world. And yet we have been able to use legal process to move the transfer of what in effect were captured internet domains, identify whose accounts were compromised, and go back to those customers so that we could let them know that their emails were compromised and that their servers were being accessed. Some of these customers are in the private sector. Some are in government. Some, in fact, were embassies and even ambassadors around the world. This type of advance gives me some cause for optimism, but the reality is that the challenge is continuing to worsen. And I think we need to take a page out of the history books. I think it's worth looking back at the diplomatic conference that took place in Geneva in 1949 that created the Fourth Geneva Convention, the convention that protects civilians in times of war. I think the time has come to consider a new convention, a digital Geneva Convention, that would bring governments to the table and cause them to commit that they will not attack in a time of peace the civilian infrastructure of other countries, that they will not attack the electrical grid, that they will not attack healthcare providers, that they will not use their resources to try to hack into the accounts of journalists or private citizens who are involved in the electoral processes that at their heart are the infrastructure of every democracy. These and other opportunities exist for governments around the world. I think we have an opportunity to learn from the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency and in effect create a new organization, non-governmental or otherwise, that can take information from experts around the world about attacks that are taking place and publicly attribute those to the governments that are behind them, just as the IAEA has done in the world of nuclear non-proliferation. And as we do all of that, I think that there is an important new role for the global technology sector. We need, in effect, to act, even in a world of rising nationalism, as a digital and neutral Switzerland. A set of companies that is committed around the world to 100% defense and 0% offense. I think we have the opportunity to come together and pledge that, in fact, we will not aid any government in attacking any customer anywhere. And we will, in fact, instead, just like the Red Cross, if you will, assist and protect customers everywhere. If we're going to live in a world that is safer, if we're going to use technology that we can trust, we're going to have to think through and address all of these issues and, in effect, think about and stand up for people everywhere. Thank you very much.